Yeah, the quote that everybody missed it. In fact, Alan Greenspan mentioned that in one of his interviews that everybody missed it: the academia, the Federal Reserve, and the regulators. That quote is not as accurate. Actually, there were people who sounded warning bells well before the crisis hit. Some of them were academics. There were at least three or four academics who sounded the warning bells that the housing market was becoming overheated. There was irrational exuberance. The housing sector was overvalued. There were academics who pointed out that banks were becoming riskier over time, and that was a cause for concern. There were some analysts who also pointed out that the bank stocks were overvalued. So it is, and there were some institutional investors who also pointed out that the bank valuations were very rich. So it is not quite as accurate to say that everybody missed the warning signals. Obviously, the thrust of my paper is that the short sellers did miss it because they started taking positions in the bank stocks well before the crisis hit. In fact, we show that the short interest increased significantly from 05 to 06 and 06 to 07. So they clearly were sensitive to the warning indicators that they could gather either from the bank's financial statements or by looking at the housing market, because this crisis was really a real estate driven crisis, and it was precipitated by the flattening and then subsequently the decrease in housing prices. And just to go into a little bit more detail, a large number of subprime mortgages that were issued leading up to the crisis, especially in 04, 05, 06 timeframe, were of the 228 or 327 type mortgages, which is there is an initial teaser rate for 2 or 3 years that resets to a much higher rate. The primary reason, or basically the basic idea in these mortgages was that these mortgages were either designed to default or to be refinanced after 2 or 3 year teaser rate. But the refinancing was predicated on the housing prices continuing to increase. So if the housing prices did not increase, these mortgages could not be refinanced, and the borrowers really did not have the financial wherewithal to make the mortgage payments at a higher rate. So essentially, we were going to have a wave of massive default, or we were going to have a massive refinancing wave. And what happened was, because the housing prices stopped increasing, housing prices peaked in the summer of 2006 and then subsequently started going down. And that's what precipitated this crisis. So this was really a real estate driven crisis to some extent. And the short sellers were either sensitive to the real estate indicators, or they could have been sensitive to the increasing riskiness of the banks that was reflected in the financial statements. So it is possible that the regulators missed it in the sense that they didn't act early enough. They responded to the developments rather than preempting some of the developments through their action. So it is very likely that the regulators missed it, but it's not accurate to say that all of the participants in the capital markets missed it, because there were some analysts as well as some institutional investors, and even one of the bond rating agencies, Egan-Jones, also mentioned that the banks were becoming riskier. So it is, I would say that there were several players in the market who sounded the warning alarms or warning bells. The problem is that many a times you need a certain threshold amount of people to act before the correction can ensue, because sentiment can also be limits to arbitrage. So if there is positive or favorable sentiment and people think the housing price is going to keep on increasing, and as a result the rich bank valuations would be sustained, it is difficult for short sellers to correct that view. They need a catalyst. So short sellers take their positions and then wait for a catalyst and wait for a trigger event. And that trigger event ended up being the decline in the housing prices. So now I would argue again that it would not be an accurate statement on part of Alan Greenspan to say that everybody missed it. There were certainly some important players who were sensitive to the buildup of risk. I think, well, they put their money where their mouth was, in the sense that they acted. To take a short position is very risky. So what they were betting is that the bank stocks were going to go down, and each time the price move against them, they have to come up with more collateral. So clearly, taking a short position is very risky. The fact that they increased their position several months leading up to the crisis tells you that they were really putting their money where their mouth was. So people could have seen those developments. They could have seen the short interest go up. So your question in some sense is, why didn't the market pick up on the fact that short sellers were selling? That's a difficult question to answer, but let me give it a try. There are several issues that are going on. For example, I talked to a money manager in San Francisco soon after the crisis hit. So this was, I think, around 2009 or 2010. And by that time, we had the first draft of this paper. And I told him, I said, the warning indicators were there even if you scrutinize the financial statements. And he said that they realized that the housing prices were not sustainable and the banks were becoming riskier. However, what he mentioned was very significant. He said, if we were the first ones to pull out our money and go to cash, our clients, our customers would have deserted us and would have gone to competitor banks. And since the evaluation of money managers is relative, not absolute, relative to other money managers, we thought, we should stay invested. So if we go down with everybody else. So, and similarly, if you look at the analysts don't have incentives to say negative things about the companies that they cover, because they run the risk of being shut out by the company. They lose access to the management. So the incentives of some of the key players in the capital markets, such as the analysts, such as the institutional investors, money managers, who are not aligned properly, I would argue, in the sense that they did not have incentives to correct this misvaluation in the banking sector. On the other hand, short sellers' incentives were aligned. They are sensitive to these indicators of overvaluation, and they take positions that potentially can correct it. But there has to be enough short selling to be able to bring the prices down, because they are basically fighting against a headwind. And unless there is a catalyst, the correction doesn't ensue. So at times, short sellers will stay on the sidelines, knowing fully well that the stocks are overvalued, if they don't see a catalyst in relatively near term. So that would have been one of the reasons why the overvaluation was sustained for as long as it was sustained. To your point, that what can be learned? I think there are a couple of lessons that we hope that readers take away from our study. One is that as banks have become more complex, the regulators have expressed an increasing desire and need to have private market regulation supplement the regulatory efforts of the government. So in other words, as the banks have become more and more complex, there has been a desire expressed by the regulators that the private market regulation will supplement or complement the regulatory efforts of the banking regulators, so that they can control the banks a little bit better. This, I think, you may have to edit it and come out as well. But the basic idea is that with the increasing complexity of banks, there is a greater desire on part of regulators to look at the private market discipline or the private market regulation that is imposed on the banks, so it can complement their efforts at bank regulation. What our study shows is that there are players in our capital markets, such as short sellers, who can impose that discipline. Clearly, analysts and institutional investors, and to some extent auditors, should have been the players who should have disciplined the banks as well. But their incentives were not aligned. As we discussed earlier, the analysts don't have the incentives to say negative things about the companies that they cover. Institutional investors have a relatively short horizon. They get evaluated every quarter and they get evaluated relative to everybody else. So it is difficult for them, for incentive reasons, to take a strong stance against the companies that they are invested in, because if they are the first ones and the correction doesn't occur over a relatively short period of time, they could lose significantly because clients would pull the funds away from them. Short sellers thus become an important player whose actions can be very informative. And so the other important lesson we would argue is that regulators ought to pay attention to the buildup of short interest at the banks. They can do something similar for other sectors as well, but certainly for a sector that is so important such as banking, I think regulators ought to be sensitive to the buildup of short interest in the banks, because they can provide the buildup of short interest in the banks could at least cause the regulators to take a closer look at the banks where the short interest is building up. One very famous academic by name of Michael Jensen has argued that audit committees ought to talk to the short sellers to understand if there are any problems at the firm. I think similar advice would apply, or one can offer similar advice to the regulators as well, which is that it's not that they need to constantly be in touch with short sellers or listen to the short sellers, but at least be sensitive that if short sellers are heavily shorting certain companies or certain banks, that should, I guess, incite them, or that should cause them to scrutinize these banks a little bit more to understand what is going on. So really what one can take away from our study is that, at least based on the evidence we provide, short sellers are not the villains or un-American or unpatriotic that they have been portrayed in the media. There is a lot of value to having pessimists in the capital markets as well. Capital markets work well when both the optimists and the pessimists have the ability to reflect their views into prices. That's what improves the efficiency of prices. If the prices get determined just by the optimist, we will have overvaluation and overinvestment and inefficient investment in the capital markets. We need both the players to play an important role in the functioning of the capital markets. And what our paper highlights is that if we had paid attention to the actions of the short sellers in the period leading up to the crisis, perhaps the regulators would have been more sensitive to the risks that were building up.